Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Mary Bell, who was an 11-year-old child killer. I was actually talking to my mum about this case like last week because this case happened the year that she was born, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying that. But yeah, it happened in 1968 and she was telling me how she was told about this case in school, and we were just talking about it and I thought, you know what, why not cover it? I will just say now, it is a very upsetting case. It does involve the deaths of two young children. Before I go any further with the video, I feel like I say this in most of my videos, but I live next to a really busy main road. There are loads of cars going past. I normally film these videos at night so that you can't really hear the cars because obviously traffic isn't as busy. But I'm filming this in the day because I think it's going to be quite a long video and I just don't have the time tonight. So I'm really sorry if you can hear those cars. I'm going to try and speak when they're not going past, but it's a main road. So I just want to quickly clarify that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved with the case. The information that I have collected for this video has been from several different sources online, all of which are linked in the description of this video if you want to do any further reading. And having said all of that, let's just get into today's case. So this case took place in Scotswood, which is a district in the West End of Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And our story begins on the 26th of May 1957 when a 17-year-old woman named Betty McCricket gave birth to her daughter called Mary. The father of this child was a man named William Bell, or as most people called him, Billy Bell, and there was actually speculation at the time as to whether Billy was actually Mary's biological father. But nevertheless, Mary grew up believing that Billy was her dad, and she also took his second name and was called Mary Bell. Mary's parents weren't actually married when they had Mary, however they got married a year later in 1958. Now, Mary had a very rough childhood. She was really badly abused and neglected by both of her parents, and neither of them, neither Billy or Betty, really showed Mary any form of love or gave her any sort of attention. Neither Billy or Betty really had any time for Mary, and the family grew up on a White House Road, which was on a very rough estate in Scotswood. Mary's mother Betty had a few mental health issues that meant that she was prone to depressive and erratic episodes. She also worked as a sex worker, and her job meant that she had to go away a lot. She had to go away with clients a lot, leaving Mary on her own in the house. And this was when Mary was just a small child. She was left alone in this house on a rough estate, so she was kind of left to look after herself and fend for herself, whereas her father Billy was a petty criminal and he was very well known to the police for his crimes. And on top of that, Billy was also an alcoholic and he could be very aggressive and violent towards people, including his daughter Mary. So as you can gather, Mary was a very neglected child. She did not grow up in a good, loving environment, and her parents just weren't capable of looking after such a young child, and her mother Betty didn't want to look after Mary either. People said that Betty would often try to give Mary away to other people because she didn't want to look after her, and it was also speculated that she actually tried to kill her daughter Mary on a few occasions. She would allegedly try to kill her, but she would make it look as though it was an accident. And on one of these occasions, Mary was only a small child. I'm not entirely sure how young she was, I couldn't find that anywhere online, but she was very young and she accidentally fell out of a window. Although people have wondered whether this was an accident at all or whether Betty actually threw or pushed her daughter out of this window. And according to some sources online, Mary actually had damage to her prefrontal cortex, which is an area of the brain that is associated with voluntary movements and decision making. I only read that on one or two sources though, I believe, so I don't know if that is 100% true and if she did have damage to that area of her brain. But if it did, then this could have contributed to what Mary went on to do later in her life, because as we know, quite a lot of killers or serial killers have suffered from head injuries in the past. On another occasion, someone said that they witnessed Betty giving her daughter Mary sleeping tablets, feeding her sleeping tablets as if they were sweets. It really seemed as though Betty was trying everything she could to get rid of her daughter, but she was trying to do it in ways that would appear accidental. Some people saw Betty's actions as determination to get rid of her daughter because she felt as though she was a burden, whereas other people wondered whether Betty may have been experiencing Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is a mental illness. Maybe Betty craved that attention and sympathy that her daughter's accidents brought her. This is all just kind of speculation, by the way. This is just some of the theories, if you can call them that I came across online. I'm not saying any of this is fact, this is just what people theorize. But what do you think about that? Let me know in the comments. Do you think that Betty was experiencing Munchausen syndrome by proxy? As far as I'm aware, she was never diagnosed with it because it is a mental illness. But yeah, do you think she was experiencing it or not? I'd be really intrigued to hear your thoughts on that. According to what Mary Bell said later in life when she was an adult, from just the age of 4, she was subjected to repeated sexual abuse. Obviously, Mary's mother Betty was a sex worker, and Mary said that Betty would allow these clients to just have their way with Mary, a child, and sexually abuse her as well. Mary said that she also witnessed her mother having sex with the clients on multiple occasions because Betty would often bring them back to their house, and I believe their house was quite small, so Mary witnessed her mother having sex with a lot of different men, and she said that a lot of the time this sex was very, very violent and aggressive. So this, alongside her father's, you know, drunkenness, criminal activity, his aggressive and violent behaviour, meant that Mary was exposed to this kind of environment at a very young age. And in her head, as a child growing up watching this stuff happen around her, being raised in that kind of environment, that would have just become the norm. She wouldn't have thought that that was anything out of the ordinary, if that makes sense. And eventually, by the age of 10 years old, Mary Bell became this very withdrawn, manipulative, violent and aggressive young child, especially towards other children. She would be very aggressive towards other children. Mary attended Delaval Road Junior School. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. And someone that she was very good friends with, who also went to the same school, was a girl named Norma Bell. Norma Bell lived next door to Mary, and although they had the same surname, they weren't related in any way, they just had the same surname. And Norma was 3 years older than Mary, so at the time this case taking place, Mary was 10 years old and Norma was 13 years old. But despite this, despite Norma being 3 years older than Mary, Mary would control Norma. Mary was a very intelligent young girl, whereas Norma was described as quite simple-minded. She wasn't the most intelligent, and this was perfect for Mary Bell because it meant that she found someone older than her, bigger than her, who she could control. People said that Mary would manipulate Norma. She would get her to do stuff that she wouldn't probably do on her own. Norma was just very easily led by Mary. And eventually, Norma Bell became Mary's accomplice in the playground at school and in murder. The other kids at their school were terrified of Mary and Norma. They knew to avoid those two at all costs, to avoid getting into a fight with them, because they were playground bullies. They were those typical playground bullies. They would go around the school and pick on the other kids. It was mostly Mary, but obviously, like I said before, Norma was very easily led by Mary. Norma would do literally anything that Mary asked her to do. In fact, people joked that if Mary asked Norma to jump off a bridge, Norma wouldn't hesitate and she would do it. And it was so strange because sometimes Mary would be fine with the other kids. She would play with them, she would get along with them fine, she would talk to them. But then if one of these kids upset her or made her angry, she would snap. It was like a switch in her personality, and she would get so furious, and the kids said that her whole face would change. Her eyes would go, her head would shake because she was so angry. On one occasion, Mary had this little girl around her throat, and she was just squeezing and squeezing until this little girl's face was literally going red, and it took another child to get Mary off this girl. The girl was eventually fine, although as you can imagine, this would have been very traumatic for her. So the kids would just try to avoid Mary at all costs. They knew about her sadistic behaviour, and even her teachers knew about her aggressive nature. One day, a young girl went into her class and her teacher, named Eric Foster, noticed that she had a red mark on her cheek which looked like a burn mark. And so the teacher asked this little girl how she got this burn mark on her cheek, and she said that 10-year-old Mary Bell had put out a cigarette on her face. Mary was confronted about this by the teacher, and she did actually admit that she did it. She didn't deny it at all, but I don't believe anything was really done about it. But of course, Mary was exposed to this kind of violence in her own home, and so I can imagine that in her head, she didn't know that it was wrong. As a 10-year-old, she would have thought this was normal behaviour. So like I said, the children in Scotswood feared Mary Bell and Norma Bell, and for good reason. On Sunday, the 11th of May 1968, 10-year-old Mary Bell and 13-year-old Norma Bell picked up a 3-year-old boy, and they told him that they were going to go and buy him some sweets. However, a short while later, this same little boy that Mary and Norma Bell picked up was found just wandering around the street. This little boy seemed dazed, he was bleeding, and although the police were contacted, no further action was taken. And then just the next day, the police were contacted again by a mother who said that 10-year-old Mary Bell had attempted to strangle her daughter in a sand pit. This little girl was named Pauline, and she said that Norma Bell had pinned her down in this sand pit whilst Mary Bell put her hands around her neck and began to strangle her. And Mary then started stuffing sand down Paulie's throat. She just kept picking up sand and stuffing it down her throat. And it was at this point that Norma Bell actually let go of Pauline. It seemed as though even she was getting scared of what Mary was doing. Thankfully, Pauline was able to get away, and she ran straight home to her mother, and her mother contacted the police. However, Pauline didn't actually tell the police the whole story. She told the police about how Mary had attempted to strangle her, but she didn't tell the police about the sand because she was so terrified of Mary, and she was scared that if she told the police everything, Mary might try and strangle her again. And again, although police had this information about Mary that she was strangling other kids, they didn't do anything. No further action was taken, which is so frustrating because just 2 weeks after this attack on Pauline, Mary Bell would commit her first murder. Martin Brown was a 4-year-old boy, and he lived in the Scotswood area with his mum. He had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he was described as a cheeky little boy. He would often get himself into mischief. In fact, one time when he was at home, he decided that he wanted to make himself a swimming pool in his bedroom, and so he filled up a drawer with water and it flooded. But he was a happy little boy. He brought his family so much joy and happiness. Then on Saturday, the 25th of May 1968, 4-year-old Martin had been playing with his friends around the local derelict houses. And although Martin had been out playing the whole day and he hadn't returned home, his family weren't too worried because this was quite typical for the time. Often parents would just allow their children to go out into the streets and play for as long as they wanted because they didn't think they were in any danger. They believed that it was safe for them to just go out and play with their friends. However, at around 5 p.m, a neighbour told Martin's mother, June, that Martin had had an accident. Martin had been found on his own, unconscious, in an abandoned derelict house in Scotswood. And by the time Martin's mother got to this abandoned house where he was found, there were just so many people stood outside just watching this man holding unconscious Martin in his arms. This man was crying as he held Martin, and Martin's mother remembers Martin's whole body just being cold, and the pigmentation had just gone from his skin. It was like he was a grey colour. He was rushed to the hospital, but sadly 4-year-old Martin Brown was pronounced dead on arrival. So the police began investigating Martin's death because obviously it was very suspicious. This was a 4-year-old boy found dead in an abandoned house. It just obviously appeared very suspicious. But they really couldn't work out what happened to him. Martin's body didn't have any obvious signs of injury or violence. There was a little bit of blood blood and saliva on his face, but apart from that, there was nothing, and the pathologist couldn't actually reach a conclusion on his death either. When the police were looking around the room that Martin was found in, they discovered some tablets on the floor, and so initially it was theorized that maybe Martin had gone into this house and found these tablets and ate them thinking they were sweets, and that's how he died. When Martin Brown was younger, he actually had an accident where he fell down the stairs, and from then on he was quite scared of stairs, and so people theorized that maybe he, because obviously he was in the upstairs of the house, maybe he looked down and he got so frightened that he died from shock. After Martin's death, one of the newspapers that were reporting about him called him the Rat Alley Boy, because the place that he was found was a very poor area in Scotswood and it was named Rat Alley, and so this newspaper called him the Rat Alley Boy, which, as you can imagine, really upset Martin's family. The fact that he was being compared to rats, that his name was almost linked to rats, really upset them. I just think that is really disgusting, to not even use his name when he has just died and to call him Rat Alley Boy. There were many theories going around about what could have happened to Martin, but ultimately the police just couldn't really find any evidence to support any of them, and so his death was just ruled as accidental. And then just 2 days after Martin's death, on the 27th of May, the police received a call saying that there had been a break-in at the local nursery. The nursery had been completely vandalised and a lot of the items inside had been destroyed. So officers began looking around this nursery in Scotswood that had just been broken into, and they found 4 pieces of paper with writing on them. These notes were written in childlike writing and they said some pretty disturbing things on them. I'll put some pictures of the notes on the screen now, but they said things such as, "I murder so that I may come back," and also, "We murder, watch out." And then on another note it said, "We did murder Martin Brown, fuck off you bastard." Obviously the police thought these notes were very strange, but they just kind of dismissed them as a sick prank. You know, most people in the area knew about Martin Brown's death at this point, and so the police just thought that this was some kid's idea of a sick joke. But the nursery actually installed an alarm system after this, and it was actually Norma and Mary Bell who broke in and vandalised this nursery and wrote these notes about Martin Brown's death. And they actually returned to the nursery a few days later. I actually don't know why Mary and Norma returned to the nursery a few nights later. I don't know whether they were intending to break in again, or maybe they just enjoyed returning to the scene of their crime. But the Monday following this, Mary Bell attended school, and in their school each child had their own news book. And in Mary's news book that Monday, she actually wrote about Martin Brown's death. I'm going to read a little bit about what Mary wrote now. So she said, "There were a crowd of people at an old house. I asked what was the matter. There had been a boy who just lay down and died." And at the bottom of this page, Mary actually drew a picture of Martin Brown's dead body. She drew Martin laying on the ground, and next to his body she drew a bottle that she labelled a tablet. And next to the drawing of Martin, she also drew a picture of a workman finding his body. On the cover of her news book, she also wrote the headline from one of the newspapers that had reported on Martin's death, and it said, "Boy found dead in old house." But despite this being in her school news book, nobody picked up on this for weeks. Now, I don't know whether Mary's teachers just didn't see her news book, which I find a little bit hard to believe, or whether they did see it and they just didn't think anything of it and they didn't bring it to anyone's attention. After the death of Martin Brown, Mary and Norma Bell would frequently go and visit his mother, June, and they would just ask her questions like, "How are you doing? How are you feeling? Are you missing Martin?" Just kind of questions like that. You see, they actually knew Martin's mother June because both Mary and Norma used to babysit for June's sister. And at first, June thought that this was really sweet of Mary and Norma, that they were asking her how she was doing. She really felt as though they cared about her and just wanted to help in any way that they could. But then just before Martin's burial, Mary and Norma Bell walked up to June, Martin's mother, and asked if they could see Martin. And June just kind of looked blank at Mary and Norma for a second because The girls knew that Martin had died. They had been visiting June for the last week, asking her how she was. So they knew that Martin was dead. They knew that they couldn't see him. So June said that to them. She said that you can't see him because he's dead. And Mary Bell responded saying, oh yeah, I know he's dead, but I want to see him in his coffin. June, of course, was very upset by this, and so she slammed the door in Mary and Norma's face, and she actually collapsed behind the door in distress. In fact, she was so distressed that her husband actually had to go and get the doctor for her. Over the next few months after Martin Brown's death, people in the local area were still so shocked by what happened, and again, people just thought his death was an unexplained accident. No one knew that something more sinister had happened to Martin Brown. In fact, his death was actually blamed on the dangerous conditions in the Rat Alley slum where his body was found. But eventually this area where Martin's body was found was demolished. And then on Wednesday the 31st of July 1968, another unexpected child death would occur. 3-year-old Brian Howe was out playing on the streets unsupervised like many other children at the time. He was watching the demolition of the derelict houses in Rat Alley when at some point Mary Bell, who was now 11 years old, approached him and asked him if he wanted to go and play with her and Norma Bell on a nearby patch of waste ground called the Tin Lizzie. And Brian agreed, and this was the last time that he was seen alive. A little while later, people began noticing that Brian was missing, and eventually his dead body was found on this waste ground where he was taken by Norma and Mary Bell. Brian was found half naked, and his arms and legs had been stretched out and extended, and he was lying on concrete next to some bushes. Snippets of Brian's hair had been cut off with scissors, and these pieces of hair were just around the scene on the ground. And he also had these unusual puncture wounds to his legs, which were believed to have happened after death. And the same scissors that had been used to cut Brian's hair were used to make these puncture wounds on his legs. But as well as this, the perpetrator had also attempted to mutilate Brian's penis. Of course, Brian's death was very suspicious. It was obvious that this was a murder, and upon initial inspection of Brian's body, the detective investigating this case had a feeling that the person or people who had done this to Brian were probably quite young, because it seemed as though it was quite a gentle death. It was later determined by the pathologist that Brian had been strangled to death, but the detectives couldn't actually tell this just from looking at his body, because as far as I'm aware, he didn't have any like bruising around his neck, and that suggested to the detectives that the person who killed Brian was a child, because it's likely that if Brian was strangled, he would have some bruising around his neck, obviously. But if a child was killing him, a child wouldn't have the power or strength in their hand to strangle another child so tightly, and so that's why there wasn't really any bruising around Brian's neck. So it seemed as though Brian had been gradually strangled to death and gently strangled to death. The post-mortem concluded that the killer had also attempted to carve their initial into Brian's stomach, and this initial was the letter M. At this point, the police began putting 2 and 2 together, and they realised that the murder of Brian Howe and the suspicious death of Martin Brown had a lot of similarities, and so they announced to the public that they were looking for a child killer. The police began realising that these 2 deaths of these 2 little boys were probably caused by the same person. So detectives visited June, Martin's mother, and they told her that although before they ruled Martin's death as an unexplained accident, they now believed that he had been murdered by the same child or children that had killed Brian Howe. And as you can imagine, June was so shocked when she was told, because up until this point, she believed that her son had died as a result of some kind of accident. So to then be told that he could have been murdered must have been just so horrific for her. At the start of the investigation, the police had a number of suspects. However, there was one child in particular that seemed to appear the most suspicious, and yes, you guessed it, it was 11-year-old Mary Bell. The police quickly noticed that every single time they would hold a press conference where they would discuss the murders of Brian and Martin, Mary Bell would always be there. She would always be there. Even though she was only 11, she would always be there listening and just wanting to know what the police knew. She seemed to have a fascination with the cases. And she would make it very obvious as well. She would push herself to the front of these conferences so that she could literally hear everything. But as well as that, in the playground at school, she would boast to the other children about how she strangled a little boy, like it was something to be proud of. And to be honest, a lot of the children weren't really that shocked when Mary was saying all this, because she was very violent and aggressive anyway, and so I imagine they probably just thought it was a matter of time till she did something more sinister. And so because of all this suspicion surrounding Mary Bell, the police decided to go and speak with her. But this proved quite difficult because her father, Billy Bell, just wouldn't let them. He would get really aggressive with the police. Obviously, he was a very violent man anyway, but he was threatening them and saying, "I'll get my big Alsatian dog on you if you try and speak to Mary." And this meant that the police couldn't really do anything because they didn't have enough evidence to arrest Mary, but her father also wouldn't let her speak to the police, so they were kind of stuck. But then shortly after this, the police actually had a breakthrough in the case, because it turns out that there was actually another young boy on the wasteland the day that Brian Howe was murdered, and he witnessed the whole thing, the whole murder. I don't know this witness's name, but he was 9 years old at the time, although he had the mental age of 4, and he came forward to police and explained to them that Mary and Norma Bell were on the wasteland with Brian Howe, and that Mary told Brian that he had a sore throat, and so she was going to help him by massaging his neck. And this was Mary's method of killing. She would tell these little boys that they had a sore throat and that she would help them by massaging their neck, but instead she would strangle them, and every so often she would tighten her grip until she had eventually strangled them to death. This little boy also said that Norma Bell was with Mary, and so now with this new witness statement, Detective Harvey Burrows ordered that Mary Bell and Norma Bell be brought into the police station for questioning. Because they were so young, Mary and Norma were questioned alongside Dr. Monica Rowbotham, who was a child psychologist. Monica said that during these questionings, Mary found it very difficult to relax and stay calm, but then at the same time she also appeared very tough and she just denied everything. She never once admitted to being involved in either of the murders, despite there being a witness who said that he saw Mary Bell strangling Brian Howe. She also seemed very distracted by other things in her questioning. She would constantly ask where her mother was her mother going to come and see her, how was her dog, and other stuff like that. And because they were suspects in this case, Mary and Norma weren't actually allowed to go home after the questionings, and so they were taken into care in the evenings. So they would go into care to sleep in the evenings, and then the next day they would come back to the police station for more questionings. One thing that the police noticed about Mary in these questionings was that she was a very intelligent 11-year-old girl. The way in which she would go about answering the questions that she was asked was just very intuitive. But despite her intelligent answers and her constant denials, the police still had a lot of solid evidence stacked up against her. So I'm just going to talk through now all of the evidence that they had against Mary Bell. So the scissors that were used to make the puncture marks on Brian Howe's body were found near the scene. And in her second questioning, Mary obviously sensed that the police were closing in on her, and so she made up a story and said that on the day of Brian's death, she actually saw an 8-year-old boy hit Brian, and she said that this boy was carrying around a pair of scissors. But the information about the scissors and the puncture marks on Brian's body hadn't actually been released to the public at this point, so how did Mary know that unless she was there? Then the police linked up the notes that were found in the nursery after the break-in that said, "We did murder Martin Brown and I murder so that I may come back." And the police quickly realised that it was Mary and Norma Bell who had obviously broken into the nursery and vandalised it and left these notes. Oh, and I don't believe I actually mentioned this part earlier, but it was found that after Mary had killed Brian Howe, she actually returned to the scene a little while later before his body was discovered, and that's when she carved or tried to carve the M initial into his stomach using a razor blade. It's believed that she may have returned to Brian's body after she killed him to kind of relive what she did, and this is actually a common characteristic in serial killers. A lot of serial killers, including Ted Bundy, would actually return to where they left the bodies to kind of remind themselves of what they did. I also read on one source online that on the day of Brian's funeral, Mary was actually spotted outside of his house just laughing and rubbing her hands together when she saw his coffin, but I'm not sure how true that is because I only actually read that on one source. But anyway, back to the evidence that the police had against Mary and Norma. So as well as the notes that were left in the nursery, the police also received more evidence when Mary's teacher looked back over Mary's school newsbook, because if you remember, she actually wrote in her newsbook about Martin Brown's death. Like I explained earlier, Mary drew a picture at the bottom of the page of Martin's dead body, and next to his body she drew a bottle that she labelled tablet. And this was pretty much all the evidence that the police needed to say that Mary Bell was involved in Martin Brown's death, because there were tablets found at the scene. However, this information hadn't been released to the public, so the only people that could have known that were the police and the killer. So back to Mary and Norma's questionings. They both took a similar approach when they were answering questions, and they actually blamed the other for the murders. They both eventually admitted to being there during the murders, but both said that it was the other one who actually carried out the murder. And on the 8th of August 1968, both 11-year-old Mary Bell and 13-year-old Norma Bell were charged with murder, and their trials began less than a month later on the 5th of September. Given the ages of the girls during the trial, the BBC and ITV were actually banned from reporting about it on their news bulletins, which I thought was an interesting fact. And the judge also allowed both Mary and Norma's solicitors to sit alongside them during the trial, just so that they would feel a little bit more at ease and relaxed. This next bit of information I only actually read on one source, so I'm not entirely sure how true it is. But according to this source, during the trial, the court were presented with some forensic evidence linking both Mary and Norma to the crimes. Apparently, there were grey fibres from one of Mary's wool dresses found on the bodies of both Martin Brown and Brian Howe, obviously suggesting that she was there when they died. And also, fibres from Norma Bell's maroon skirt were found on Brian Howe's shoe. But like I said, I only read that bit of information on one source, so just like in their police questionings during the trial, they took the same approach. Both of the girls blamed each other for the killings. Throughout most of the trial, people said that Mary was quite blank looking. She appeared to show no emotion, but that was until she was cross-examined and she was asked if she had ever tried to strangle a pigeon, because apparently they had some form of evidence that she had tried to strangle the pigeon in the past. And so when she was asked about this, she became very, very upset, to the point where the court actually had to have a break so that she could calm down. But apart from that incident, Mary was her usual self during the trial. She was very blank, showed no emotion really whatsoever. She could sharply answer questions. Like I said before, she was a very intelligent young girl. She would make sort of like witty remarks when she answered questions that she was asked. Whereas Norma Bell was the complete opposite. Obviously, we know that she was simple-minded. She wasn't as intelligent as Mary, and she was very insecure, and it was obvious to the jury that Mary had been the ringleader in these killings and that Norma was coerced into the murders. At the end of the trial, the jury concluded, with information from the psychologist that did an examination on Mary, that she showed no remorse or anxiety during the whole trial and that she demonstrated psychopathic tendencies. Like I mentioned earlier, it was very clear to the jury that it was Mary who carried out the murders despite her trying to put the blame on Norma. And so on the 17th of December 1968, 11-year-old Mary Bow was found guilty of manslaughter. Now obviously Mary was charged with murder, but she was found guilty of manslaughter, and the reason for this was because psychiatrists said that she could not be held responsible for her actions because, and I quote, she had classic symptoms of psychopathy. So she was diagnosed as a psychopath and therefore she couldn't be held responsible for her actions. Whereas Norma Bell was actually acquitted on the grounds that she was coerced by Mary because she was simple-minded, and so she was just sent to live with her family in Scotswood. She wasn't charged with anything. It's believed that Norma was never the one to carry out the killings. That was always Mary. Norma was just there at the scene, and because she was simple-minded, the jury determined that she didn't understand, she didn't know the seriousness of what Mary was doing, and so she wasn't charged with anything and she was just allowed to go back to live with her family in Scotswood. So at this point, once Mary had received her verdict, they didn't actually know what to do with her because her case was so unique, and because she was so young, authorities didn't know where to send her once she had been found guilty. Because she was so young, she couldn't be sectioned under the Mental Health Act and sent to a psychiatric unit, but she also couldn't go to prison either. And the authorities believed that they had a responsibility to rehabilitate Mary. They believed that she wasn't beyond help. They believed that they could help her. So initially, Mary was sent to a place called Cumberlow Lodge, which was a remand school in Croydon, but she wasn't there for long before she was sent to Red Bank Secure School in Lancashire, where she was the only girl among 22 boys. But her time in Red Bank actually went really well. She got a lot of help from professionals and her treatment seemed to be working. Mary's mother Betty would often go and visit Mary in the Red Bank unit. However, despite this, their relationship was pretty bad. There was a lot of resentment there on Mary's part. You see, Mary always blamed Betty for the way that she turned out and for her crime. She said that if she hadn't been raised, if she hadn't grown up in the kind of environment that she did grow up in, that she wouldn't have turned out like that. In fact, Mary would actually write her mother letters from the Red Bank unit begging her mother to go to the court and take blame for the murders, because in Mary's eyes, Betty was the guilty one, not her. In one of the letters that Mary wrote to her mother, she said, "Please, ma'am, put my tiny mind at ease. Tell judge and jury on your knees. They will listen to your cry of please. The guilty one is you, not me. I am sorry it has to be this way. We'll both cry and you will go away. Tell them you are guilty, please. So then, ma'am, I'll be free. Your daughter May." By 1972, so 4 years after the murders, Betty was described as a broken woman. She relied heavily on drink and drugs, and she actually did a television interview where she talked about Mary's crime. So if I can, I will play a little bit of that interview now.
Now, Betty, are you saying that your daughter is innocent?
No, I'm not saying she's innocent.
But something must have made her do these things.
Yes, something possibly must have made her do these things.
What was it about her life and her family you think that could have driven her to these things?
Maybe it's the arguments between my husband and myself might have had some inflict on her. I don't know.
Have you been very despairing sometimes?
Very despairing, very under a lot of strain, stress and grief for my daughter.
However, Betty would actually sell stories to the media about her daughter Mary and the murders. And as well as this, she would also sell letters and drawings that Mary had written. There was no loyalty there, it seemed, to her daughter. She didn't really care about telling the media these stories about Mary as long as she got some money for it. Since the crimes, psychologists determined that Mary had no proper attachment to other humans. There was no emotion there. She didn't display any care for others that normal people would, and it's believed that this is because she was never shown that love and care as a child. She grew up around violence. She was never shown any attention or love or care, and so she herself never adopted any of these characteristics. During her imprisonment, Mary was examined by many different psychologists, and they said that she would never acknowledge her guilt. She would never admit that she was guilty, but at the same time she wouldn't deny it either. She kind of just refused to talk about her crimes. In 1978 she was moved to Ashcombe Grange Open Prison, and 2 years later in 1980, 12 years after the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe, Mary Bell was released because authorities determined that she was no longer a danger to children or a threat to society. Mary was 23 years old when she was released, and she was granted lifelong, I can never say this word, anonymity. And she was given a brand new name, meaning that she was able to start a brand new life. A few years after her release in 1984, Mary actually gave birth to a daughter, and this daughter was also granted anonymity. And Mary never told her daughter about her past or who she really was or about the crimes that she committed when she was 10 years old, and so her daughter grew up not really knowing who her mother was. That was until 1998 when somehow reporters managed to track down Mary Bell and find her address, and so her and her daughter actually had to leave their house with like bed sheets over their heads so that the reporters couldn't get a photo of them. And Mary Bell's current whereabouts is unknown. No one has any idea where she is or who she is. She's in protective custody, so she's at a secret address, and she's just out there living her life as a 62-year-old woman now. I believe she's actually a grandmother now as well. Now, this next part absolutely infuriates me, and I'm sure it will anger a lot of you guys too, but basically, in 1998, a book called Cries Unheard was written about Mary's case and her crimes. And the author of this book actually reached out to Mary Bell and offered her a large sum of money if she would help her write this book. Not write it, but kind of give her more information about her crimes and her life and stuff like that. Not about her life now, obviously, as a new person with a new name, but her life when she was growing up and the kind of like environment that she grew up in. And Mary Bell accepted, and she was paid to talk about her crimes, even though in prison she pretty much refused to talk about them. Now that she was being paid, she suddenly was fine talking about them and giving this author more information about the killings. As you can imagine, the public was absolutely furious when they learned about this, as were the mothers of Mary's victims, obviously, and they actually said that the money made from this book should go to charity instead of the murderer. I don't know exactly how much Mary was paid for her participation in this book. One article that I read said that it was around £50,000. But regardless of how much she made, I just think it's so wrong. I just can't believe that this was allowed, that she was allowed to profit from her crimes. I just cannot believe that the murderer profited from these crimes, and the families of the victims, as far as I'm aware, didn't receive a penny. That is the end of this case. That is the case of Mary Bell. Please let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments. I would love to hear your opinions. I was getting so frustrated when I was researching this case because I just feel like Mary displayed so many warning signs, and if they were picked up on, then the deaths of those two little boys could have been prevented. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a big thumbs up. And quickly before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description of my videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know your case suggestions in the comments. But yeah, I'm gonna go now, so I will see you very soon for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys.